Hello and welcome to Book of the Mouse Club, episode 21, Thursday, May 30th, 2019.
Morning, monsieur.
Where are you off to?
The bookshop. I just finished the most wonderful story about a beanstalk and an ogre and
That's nice. Marie! The baguettes! Hurry up!
I'm sorry, but how can one possibly pay attention to a book with no pictures in it?
My dear child, there are a great many good books in this world without pictures.
I almost bounced clear out of the book. Some bouncing, huh?
Come home or make myself known.
J. Thaddeus Turtle, Esquire. Have you never met him? You will find his story in this delightful little book, The Wind and the Willows.
I've come to return the book I borrowed.
Finished already?
Oh, I couldn't put it down. Have you got anything new?
Welcome back, listeners, and we'd certainly like to take a moment to welcome any new listeners. It's been a busy month for us, but we're happy to be back and deliver on our May installment as promised. You may be joining us after listening to Notably Disney or the Tomorrow Society podcast. We are both on that show and really enjoyed it. So any new listeners, stay tuned towards the end of the episode for an announcement about our upcoming summer series, which we hope to bring to you a little more frequently. But if you're joining us for the first time, I'm your host, Courtney, and I am joined once again by my lovely co-host, Emily.
Hello, listeners. Courtney, it's so great to be back on our podcast. It's been a month.
I know, but we've been around to some other podcasts. It was fun to be on the other side of the microphone and be the ones answering questions.
Yeah, but it's really exciting that we are now back and have an author interview.
Yep, so today we are once again asking the questions, and we're joined by a special guest, Lou Prosperi, author of the Imagineering Toolbox series, which currently includes book number 1, The Imagineering Pyramid, using Disney theme park design principles to develop and promote your creative ideas, and book number 2, The Imagineering Process, using the Disney theme park design process to bring your creative ideas to life. Welcome, Lou.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Lou, it's so great to have you on our show. We've been keeping up with you through Twitter and other social media, but our listeners will want to know more about you. So before we talk about your book, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your relationship with Disney?
Sure. So I currently work as a manager of a technical writing team and curriculum development team for a large enterprise software company. So I'm involved in technical communication, writing user manuals and installation guides and developing training materials. I'm a father of 2. My son just finished his 3rd year of college, and my daughter graduates from high school on Saturday. So that's been very exciting. Last night was the prom, and a whole bunch of other things are happening. In terms of my relationship with Disney, I was a fan of the films and some of the TV shows. I used to watch The Wonderful World of Disney and The Wonderful World of Color on Sunday nights with my family, and I watched the films. In fact, on our second date, my wife and I met for dinner and then went back to her house and watched The Little Mermaid together. So that movie sort of has a special place for us. And my first exposure to Disney parks, however, was my honeymoon. We never went when I was a child, and so we went there. And back then, this was in May of 1993, there were times of year when the parks weren't too crowded. And so our first day, we went to Epcot first, and we went to Future World, and it was rainy too. And so we literally walked on everything. We went on Spaceship Earth, we went in the Universe of Energy, we went on the Wonders of Life, we went to Horizons, World of Motion, then across to the other side to Journey into Imagination. And at the time, I was working as a game designer in the adventure game industry, working on role-playing games such as Dungeons and Dragons. Not Dungeons and Dragons, but games like that. And though I did work on that also in a freelance capacity at another time. And so I was in a creative field, but this level of immersion and storytelling was something that I had never seen before, and it just sort of really captivated me. And in fact, the one moment that really sort of grabbed me was in the original Journey into Imagination, which I know neither of you have seen because I heard your interview with Dan Heaton, and I know when you both started to go to the parks. it's unfortunate because I think you would have liked it. There's a scene you come away from meeting Dreamfinder and Figment, and I don't know if you've watched the videos, so maybe you know what I'm talking about, but you come across, there's a big carousel where you journey along with Dreamfinder and Figment where he tells the story that's in the song. And then you go through some other scenes and you come across this one scene and the word avalanche is carved out of rocks, sort of stretched down over this entryway. And it was just, it struck me so powerful that it was an example of creativity, like to the nth degree, if you will, right? It was such the epitome of the creative process. And so I started to become sort of interested in how they do what they do and what lessons there might be there to apply to other creative fields, such as game design, which is what I was involved in at the time. And we went again a couple years later and then, had kids and life got in the way and we didn't go back again till 2005. And along the way, I started to discover that more and more books had been written about Imagineering and the parks. And I loved to read and I loved to collect books. And so I started collecting and studying with an eye towards understanding the Imagineering process, not the title of my book, but in lowercase p process, and what lessons it could apply, again, to the creative process in general, whether it be game design or later on I became an instructional designer and trainer. And actually the very first iteration of the content that became these two books was a presentation at a conference down in Orlando, in fact, at a conference called the Society for Applied Learning Technology, or SALT. And it was about applying Imagineering to instructional design, which is why there's a chapter about instructional design in each of the two books as well.
Yeah.
So that's it in a nutshell. I mean, maybe more than a nutshell, but
that's kind of cool. It's interesting to come into the parks a little bit later in life. And I think granted, our timeline a little bit more from our previous interviews, but kind of the same. I was not really big of a parks fan until probably, for me, like my 10th visit or so. I was much more in tune with the movies because I didn't travel or go as much as I was younger, like Courtney did. She grew up a parks fan. Mm-hmm. Going a lot more frequently than I have. So I can relate to you in that aspect that, it took a little bit to get there, but now that you kind of have a different set of eyes also when you're older, that you can appreciate those creative processes along with the immersion at the same time. And that's been the basis of both of your books in the Toolbox series.
Right. Yes. So as I said, I started to sort of try to dig in to understand how they did what they did. And I started with the process, honestly, and breaking down the process part. And then I was reading a book about Pirates of the Caribbean by Jason Searle called Pirates of the Caribbean from the Magic Kingdom to the Movies. You may be familiar with that book. Mm-hmm. And there was a line in it that really caught my eye. And it's actually quoting another book. It's quoting a book called Disneyland Inside Story by a former Imagineer named Randy Bright. And he had a conversation with Blaine Gibson, the well-known Imagineer sculptor who, sculpted Lincoln and all the Hall of Presidents and many, many of the figures, the animatronic figures that we know. And he was trying to explain the idea that you only have a few seconds to convey a scene. And so they do it by creating these scenes that are readable. And when I read that, I realized that that's what we do in instructional design. When we create an illustration or a diagram, I work in software. So if we capture a screenshot and we're trying to explain something that's somewhat complex and simplify it, that's really what we do. We're creating this readable scene. And so I realized beyond the process, there were these other principles maybe at work. And so obviously, the Imagineers are very focused on story. And so then I had story and I had readability. And then the more I looked, the more I found, right? So then, discovered they use forced perspective a lot to use the illusion of size, and they keep their environments active through kinetics, and they introduce and reinforce their subject matter using pre-shows and post-shows. So as I dug a little deeper, I found these principles that all had parallels or applicability to instructional design. And again, that was sort of my focus at the time. And my first version of this actually didn't have a pyramid, and it didn't have all 15 principles. It had, 10 or 11 or 12. And then I refined it a little bit and identified a couple more, like Hidden Mickeys wasn't in there originally, and I don't remember which of the others. And then once I had 15, then I sort of realized that they naturally grouped together into the tiers that formed the pyramid. And so from there, again, I did that presentation. And then when I did that, I sort of had this idea in my head that I think so I started with instructional design. If we took this and made it a little broader, I think a book might be in there somewhere that could apply to other creative fields. And the whole point is, again, in creativity, there's lots of books about how to have new ideas and there's about that sort of stuff, but there's not so much about how do creative people do what they do. And so one of the goals of the first book in the pyramid was to look at an example of a creative organization. And again, I think Imagineering is about as creative an organization as you get. I think it's, one of the pinnacles in terms of creativity, in terms of employing multiple disciplines. And look at what they do in their creative process and how those principles at work can be applied to other fields. So that's sort of where this came from. And I had started a couple outlines for the book and then, got busy in my personal life. So I set it aside and I did that a couple times or started drafting some content. And then after I did that conference that I told you about, I posted my slides online on Scrib.com or SlideShare, one of those websites. And I got an email from Bob McLean at Theme Park Press, who said, "Hey, I found your Imagineering presentation, and I think if it was a little broader, I think you could make a book out of this."
Nice. Would you mind describing that publishing process? So he came to you by finding your slides, but where did you go from there together?
Yeah, so it was a happy coincidence that he had the same sort of vision that I did, right? I had this idea, like I think it could be a book. And I started putting, outlines, proposals together, and the inner critic inside was saying, no one will ever buy this. You're the only one who thinks this is valuable. But then when he sent me that note, I realized, hey, maybe there's somebody else, at least one other person out there who thinks this is a good idea. So we sort of exchanged, discussion back and forth, some details, et cetera. And Bob is pretty easy to work with. And he handles most of the production process.
Okay.
So he had seen my slides, so he didn't even require or ask for a proposal or an outline, really. He just trusted that I would take that and elaborate. And he had an interesting game design, so he specifically said it would be good if we included game design.
Yeah.
And so that's why I was working as a manager too. So those are the three sort of non-creative fields that I attack. Now, game design is creative, but instructional design is not what we generally think of when we think of the quote creative fields, nor is business and management. But sort of one of the assertions I have in the book is that there's a creative aspect to everything we do. And so
I identified with the instructional design piece because you also related it to classroom teaching. And as a teacher, I could see that process of how you disseminate knowledge to other people. You're trying to teach them a skill or a process of some sort. So that clicked for me in that chapter because game design was really interesting because I have no background in it whatsoever. But I think once I hit the instructional design, because my background as a teacher, the pyramid clicked for me a little bit more of what that should look like.
Whereas I was on the leadership and management side because I'm more in that business side of things. So it's great that there's different ways that people can take it.
Right, and that was one of the goals. So in the book, I have a chapter on each of the principles in the pyramid, and then I explore how the Imagineers use it, but then also how it applies outside, beyond the berm is the phrase I use, right? So, and the goal was, so hopefully those examples in each of the individual chapters would help get people to realize, oh, maybe this applies to me. But by looking at different metaphors, I thought that would also help people understand how it could click with them. Even if you're not a game designer, my hope is that a couple of those examples and the descriptions in the game design chapter may click in one way or another. Even if it's an instructional designer who has to gamify something, right? Which is one of those sort of trends that's coming up, right? So the idea was to sort of look at this pyramid in 3 or 4 different lenses with the hope that one of them would help, people see how they could apply it to their own work.
Yeah, that was something I was curious. We had a question about it, but you hit it just like rather like taking those specific approaches versus a more holistic to kind of drive it home. I was curious what led you to that, and you summed it up nicely. What I'd like to know, though, is a little more about your writing process, since you said you were initially designing this as a presentation, then you get approached to turn it into a book. How did you go about writing, I guess, the presentation itself, but then also did you have to expand more for the book?
Writing the presentation, I had been doing product training a lot. So working in PowerPoint was sort of a medium I was very comfortable in. And so I designed my own graphics versions of the pyramid. I've lost track of the number of different graphic illustrations of the pyramid that I've seen over, that since I first did it in 2010 till now, like multiple times. But so I just, basically had a slide or 2 for each principle, depending on the principle and how much else I wanted to say. For example, the Hidden Mickeys chapter, there's a little exercise that I stick in there about an image that you're supposed to look at to see if you see what it really is. I don't want to give it away. And so that became its own slide. So whenever I presented it, I could, reveal it to people, and some of them knew it right away, but some would sort of nod and say, "Oh yeah, now I get it." So that kind of came naturally. In terms of the book, I start, so one of the principles is storyboards that I talk about, and I'm a big believer. I use mind mapping for almost everything that I do. And so I started with a big mind map outline where I just had chapters and sections. And originally the plan was one big book that had both the pyramid and the process, and it was going to be called the Imagineering Toolbox. But as I got into writing, I realized that based on the word count that we had, the rough word count that Bob and I had agreed on, and the pace I was writing at, I was going to be leaving myself virtually no space to talk about the process. And so rather than skimp a lot, I reached out to Bob and said, "Hey, I think instead, how about we take the process out and we do a separate book?" And he said, "Sure, that sounds like a great idea." So I stripped it all out. So the outline originally started with that. And I also had originally planned to have sections that had more. So, I have Imagineering instructional design, Imagineering game design. I had ideas for Imagineering retail stores or Imagineering communication or a couple of other topics. But along the way, I either couldn't come up with enough useful examples for some of those ideas, and the book was getting long. And so I settled down to those 3 main other fields, also counting on the fact that the general descriptions of the individual principles would all cover some of those other fields.
Could you give us, for our listeners, Courtney and I have obviously read the book, but could you give us like a 3-minute summary of the pyramid, or if you want to use an attraction to explain how the pyramid works? I'm noticing we're talking about the pyramid a lot. Our listeners might not realize what that is.
Yeah, I thought about that too. So bad Lou, no pre-show. So anyway, so the pyramid, the Imagineering Pyramid, is a set of principles that are used by the Disney Imagineers in the design and construction of the theme parks, that not only present those principles in terms of how they're used in the theme parks, but also how they can be applied to other fields. And it has 5 tiers. The bottom tier has 5 blocks, and those are focused on, that's the Imagineering foundations. So that deals with story, creative intent, attention to detail, theming, and then the organizing of details into long and medium and close shots. The second tier is about what I call wayfinding, or helping to guide and lead your audience. So that includes weenies, which are those visual magnets that Walt Disney talked about, like Cinderella Castle. Transitions, how we move from space to space or scene to scene. Storyboards, how we keep our focus on the larger picture as we're working, so we don't get lost in the weeds. And then pre-shows and post-shows, how we introduce and reinforce our subject matter. The middle tier is about visual communication. There's 3 blocks there. Forced perspective, which is about the illusion of size. Readability, which is simplifying complex subjects. And then kinetics, which is about how the Imagineers employ movement and motion and activity to keep the park experience dynamic and active for us. The second to top tier is about making the experience memorable. And there's two principles there. There's the It's a Small World effect, which is about repetition. All I have to do is say that, and now we all have the song in our head.
It's already stuck.
That's right. It's already stuck. And then Hidden Mickeys. And Hidden Mickeys is about engaging the audience and having them sort of participate a little bit. And then the top of the pyramid is Walt's cardinal rule, and that's plussing. And that's a principle that he developed way, way back about constantly looking for ways to improve what we do. So that may have been more than 3 minutes, but that's sort of
that was a great summary.
I was curious if there was a block in the pyramid or a step in the process that you think you personally struggle with at times.
Well, tonight I struggled with pre-shows.
No worries. That was our fault as well.
No. That's a good example. I think kinetic is an interesting one because I work in the written medium for the most part, keeping things dynamic and active is somewhat difficult. Now, in a written medium, to me, that means even just mixing up the way we present information. So having a combination of text, blocks of text, but bulleted lists or checklists or graphics, or just, making the experience a little more dynamic. Sometimes you get a book and you get 10 pages in a row with no headings, nothing that breaks up the content at all. It's somewhat daunting to read when you encounter stuff like that, at least for me.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's something, especially, not just in a book, but in emails. I really try to apply that as well. Like bullet points, keep their attention with the headline, the headings and the underlines to guide them through the page.
Mm-hmm.
I think personally for me on the pyramid, I might also have to, I think more agree with, I struggle sometimes with the post-show. I think as a teacher, because with some time restraints that we have, you don't always have the time to wrap things up really nicely in a bow. So I'm thinking more recently, coming close to the AP exam that I was giving for my government students, because of all the snow days, I had a whole unit to teach in less than 2 weeks. And it was, okay, we came in, there was no pre or post show. It was, here's the nut and bolts of it. And it does not make for good teaching, but it was just a situation I was thrown in. But I think those are ones that I see often in my profession, that either the pre-show or the post-show, and more often it's the post-show, how you wrap it up before you transition into something else, is what tends to get lost, particularly with restraints on lots of things. But that's, I think, one of the harder skills on the teaching end, is how to conclude things nicely.
I can see that.
We have so you mentioned a lot of Disney Imagineers. And that was really cool. I really appreciated how you brought in lots of sources and a lot of the reading material, and you quote a lot of Imagineers. But we're going to challenge you for a second. We want you to pick one. If you had to pick one Imagineer that's had the greatest influence on you, just one.
I never want to answer just one.
It's like picking a favorite child. He has more than one child. You can't.
I think, given the amount of research I've done with them, I'm going to have to go with Alex Wright and the Imagineering Field Guide series.
Okay.
It feels wrong to not say John Hench, because he's such a pivotal figure. Those were the two. It was the tie between. Yeah. Those were the two I was going to say. But, it's funny, just last week, or when you did your discussion with Dan on the Tomorrow Society, I heard you talk about those. I love those books. I was lucky enough to bring all 6 of mine and meet with Alex Wright, and he signed them all.
Oh, that's awesome.
But I have all 6. I actually have 8. I have the original version of Magic Kingdom and the original version of Epcot, and then I have the new and improved versions. And those, I just think, are so much more valuable and useful than their size and style suggests. They seem like this simple little thing, that how much real insight can you get out of those? But they're just jam-packed with details. And in fact, so the one thing I don't like about them is that they weren't indexed. And so, unless I happen to remember that they talked about kinetics in the chapter about Frontierland, for instance, that detail is going to be lost. So one of the things I did in preparation for as I did my initial research for the Imagineering Pyramid, was I created an index of all those books, and of each of them. And then I put them together in a master index that I have online. So if you go into this master index and you say you want to find examples of kinetics, you can find all the references to kinetics across all 6 of those books. And it was an invaluable resource. I created a resource of my own that turned out to be really helpful as I was writing the 2 books.
That's amazing. We'll be sure to put that in the show notes because I'm sure a lot of our listeners would enjoy just thumbing through there. It's kind of like bonus features for the books almost.
Right. Yeah, and I even indexed the artwork. So if there was concept art on a page or a storyboard or an elevation, I discovered late in the process that I hadn't been 100% consistent, and I did not go back and fix it. So the later books got a little bit more detail than the first couple I did, but I just haven't had the time to go back and do it.
You've been busy writing books, so that's understandable. You have 2 in the series. I'm curious, do you have plans to expand your toolbox any further?
I am actually working on book number 3 now.
Ooh.
And so I mentioned that one of the other ideas that I had was Imagineering communication and Imagineering these other things. And then I ended up, for various reasons, not doing it. One of the things I don't think I was as successful with the first book as I could have been or should have been was explaining how these principles apply specifically to communication. And so the new book is about that. And it's specifically about how the Imagineers use these principles to tell their stories. And I'm writing it in a very different style. It's a fiction style. It's a group of friends go to the Magic Kingdom and have a tour, an Imagineering storytelling tour with a former Imagineer who walks them through the park and shows them examples of these principles in work, in action. The other reason I'm doing it this way is I want to try to show the principles at work instead of just tell about them, because I've done a lot of research, and for a non-Imagineer, I think I'm pretty knowledgeable about what they do. You know, for someone not in the field, I feel I'm actually pretty knowledgeable. But I'm just Lou Prosperi, a guy who wrote a book, right? So to many people,
You wrote 2
like,
books.
why? Right. Well, that's true. But to many people, like, who is this guy and why should I believe him? So part of the goal of the 3rd book is to not just say, here, I'm telling you that kinetics works like this. Instead, this group of friends are going to stop. They're going to ride Big Thunder Mountain. And then after, they're going to walk up to Nugget Way, and they're going to realize that all around them, they're surrounded by movement and action. Or the other spot they're going to go down is stand right in front of the runoff from Splash Mountain. And so in front of them, they got Splash Mountain. Up ahead, they can see the logs coming down the hill. Behind them, they have the Liberty Bell moving around. Next to them, they have people walking. So it's trying to show examples of these principles in action through this tour through the Magic Kingdom. And I'm including some silly banter between the characters, and, you know, they all are developing their own little quirky personalities. So it's been a lot of fun. And so eventually they'll all get together and compare notes and talk about how they can apply. And the reason they're doing this is because they all have problems at their jobs, and all the problems have to do with telling their story or communicating an idea. And so the idea is they're all going to go here and learn about how the Imagineers tell their stories with an eye towards how they can take some of those lessons back home and hopefully apply them.
So how has, you said, shifting from the current writing style that you have for your first 2 books to more of a fiction writing style, how's that transition been for you? Is this the first time you're writing in a fiction type format?
It's not the first.
Okay.
When I worked as a game designer, I wrote a short story that was based on the setting of the game I worked on. And in some of the products we did, we would do a little introductory fiction. So I had written some, but not that much. And I was not that comfortable about it, quite honestly, because I tended to tell instead of show. You know, like characters would end up just telling one another about a lot of stuff. And I'm still doing that to a certain point, to a certain extent in this book, because the Imagineer knows more than these other people do. But it's been fun. It's been an interesting shift. It's gone better than I thought it would. It's coming more naturally to me than I feared it would. It's interesting. So I start in a funeral, actually. because these are a group of friends from high school that don't see each other very often, and they see each other at a funeral, and it's the second funeral in like 2 years that they run into each other, and one says, "We've got to stop meeting this way." So they decide. One of their friends happens to be a Disney travel agent, so she plans a visit for them to all go with their families. And so it was interesting to sort of come up with this story of who these people are, and then sort of follow them through this bit. And we don't, get into a whole lot of detail, but one of them really likes Peter Pan, and he's never been, but he really likes it now. One of them went, and she loved the Haunted Mansion and can't wait to go. And then when she goes on the Haunted Mansion, she realized it's changed a lot, and that's where they talk about plussing. So I try to sort of make it feel natural. We'll see how successful I am.
Yeah, no, it sounds like a fun way to, challenge yourself into something new, which I'm sure a lot of Imagineers have had to do across the way. Is there an idea of when our listeners can expect this new book? Do you have a timeline for release?
The publisher is hoping to have it available by the holidays.
Okay, awesome.
And I have sort of a soft target for my first draft to be this summer, which should give me enough time to do a couple edit passes. So that goes back to the publishing process and the writing process a little bit. What I try to do when I finish a draft, I tend to write from beginning to end. I skip a little bit back and forth, but for the most part, I just want to go from beginning to end. And then once I'm done, I generally I print out a copy of it and I set it aside for a day or two, and then I read it and highlight it and mark it up, and then I edit. I make those edits, and then I print it again and I set it aside for a couple days, and then I read it again, but this time I read it out loud to myself.
I just have to say, as a former Writing Center tutor, you're hitting all of the boxes for my motto of all good writing is rewriting.
And then I find all the other things that I missed the first time I read it and proofread it. So and then once I've done that, generally I'll do those two passes. And then along the way, if I happen to find other stuff, I fix it, but I don't do another third dedicated proofread.
Because then you have an editor.
Right. And then I send it to Bob, and then he does an edit, and I think with the first book, he said he took about 5% out. He trimmed about 5%. The second book, he took a little bit more, just tightening some things up. So, so that's a little bit more about my process, at least, and the reading out loud to myself has proved to be, I was surprised at how much more I found.
Oh, I'm a big fan of that as well.
My eyes just glazed over, and I thought setting it aside for some time would give me fresh enough perspective, but I still sort of filled in the gaps. When you read your own writing, you just know what you meant to say. And so when you've left out the word "the" a couple times, you don't even notice that you left it out.
It's when you take it word by word, you're like, wait, the word that I thought was there is not actually there. So I completely understand. I'm also curious how you see your books. So you have book 1, book 2, and now this third one. Do you think that's something that our listeners should read in succession because it's building, or is it more something that they can turn to book 2 if that's more aligned with what they're looking to do?
I think you can come at them in any order. And I think the third one will certainly be true of that. It's one of the things I'm sort of debating as to whether or not in the third one I want to even talk about the pyramid, or if I just want to talk about these principles as things they do. When I was working on the outlining for the third book, my original thought was to try to figure out a way to do it in the pyramid order. And I was going to go through all the different parks and try to really sort of contrive this visit so that they could see examples. And then I decided instead I would just start at Town Square and make my way through the park and let the attractions tell me what principles to talk about. So when they sort of meet up at the end, they'll talk about it, and sort of the Imagineer will sort of organize it and say, well, these 5 are all foundational principles and these 3 are about visual communication, sort of organize it. But I'm debating whether or not to actually say that it's the Imagineering Pyramid or not. We'll see. That may come across a little forced, or maybe I'll just do it in my own little author afterward once I'm out of the fictional voice. But back to your question, I think you can do it in any order. One of the things I tried to do in the Imagineering Process book, so the pyramid looks at the principles, the process looks kind of C-Spot Run explanation here, looks at the process that they follow, and it breaks it down into these 7 pieces that the Imagineers use when they start with, we need a new ride in Fantasyland. How do they go from there to opening up Seven Dwarfs Mine Train, for example? In that, I referenced some of the bits about the pyramid. And for readers who haven't seen it, I included an appendix that has a summary of the pyramid, just so that they can get a little bit of context in terms of what it is. I definitely think they work well together, but I think they stand alone as well. Actually, I was at a conference, a Society of Technical Communication conference, back in March, and I did a workshop where I sort of combined them, and I went through the process, the big 7 pieces of the process, and along the way. So, for instance, in Blue Sky, in the Blue Sky step of the process, we said, well, stop, let's talk about story and creative intent. And then we got to concept development. We talked about the next set of principles. And so I sort of spread the principles of the pyramid out throughout the steps of the process. And that was kind of interesting as well, a different way to sort of look at the content.
As you approach the theme parks, knowing what you've studied with the pyramid, creating the pyramid, and also understanding the Imagineering process, can you pick a favorite attraction? Is there one that just stands out to you because you see all those elements?
Yeah, I think Expedition Everest at Animal Kingdom is one of the better examples. I think it's true. Like the phrase, the subtitle of the Expedition Everest chapter of the book called The Disney Mountains it's called Expedition Everest: Imagineering at its Peak. I think that's aptly named because I think it really is a great example of a lot of different principles. It's just a whole lot of fun, obviously. And actually, I believe when you look at the process book, there's a bunch of examples about Expedition Everest in there as well. So that's probably, it's one of my favorites. The original Journey into Imagination is probably my all-time favorite attraction, but I can't ride that anymore.
You and Courtney are kindred spirits.
I miss it.
Oh, that's right. You probably did ride it, but you were young at the time.
I was very young. I have tiny memories. I remember the ImageWorks more vividly. But I definitely, I met Dreamfinder as a little girl. And then, when I looked back at stuff, I was like, okay, yeah, that was the scary part with, the dark literature side and all. But yes, I would say, that was, pinnacle. But then you're right, Expedition Everest, what's interesting about that, I think it's one of the last attractions that really doesn't have an IP tie-in to it, if you think about that as well. I'm trying to think if there's anything that was created after Everest, which would be almost 15 years now.
Maybe something at California Adventure.
Or Shanghai. Yeah. But at Walt Disney World, it's been a while. So I can see how that, you're right, it brings all of it together.
With Everest, it's interesting that, I've ridden the attraction so many times that I understood, because you describe Everest as part of your book as one of the main examples going through the different processes and steps of the pyramid. But I think fast passes have kind of hurt the pre-show element just a little bit, because you end up passing through a lot of that Yeti Museum and some of the other things that set up that pre-show. As much as I love our fast passes, but I was realizing that I didn't really catch on to the museum stuff till probably maybe my college program, which was only 5 years ago. Oh God, 5 years ago. But I didn't really, because I always had a fast pass. And when I finally had the opportunity to I didn't get a fast pass, I have to wait in line like everyone else. That's when you finally get the time to absorb that pre-show. So I'm curious if in some ways our operations are kind of hindering a little bit of the Imagineering intent and process.
I feel like it challenges the pyramid almost. Okay, it's fast pass, you have the full story, but let's get that pre-show in briefly as fast as you can.
Yeah, and I think the fast pass queue has an abbreviated version.
It
has a couple of display cases. but generally. Now, the real trick is I generally do that single rider.
Yeah, that doesn't have anything.
And that's got nothing. And so, and depending on my schedule, if I saw it was only 15 minutes for standby, I would probably do it just to enjoy it. But, there's so much other stuff to do, There's lots of other you get to the other side of the park, and then you're over in Pandora, and then you see it's only 10 minutes at Expeditionary Everest. By the time you get there, the standby time could be completely different.
Moving forward, as you're writing these new books, do you have advice for aspiring Disney authors?
I guess the key thing I would say is do your research. There's a whole lot out there, and you don't want to just be reiterating the things that other people have said. This is one of the things I struggle with a little bit, particularly in this new book. I'm trying not to be completely repetitive from my first two, because if I'm talking about transitions, for example, in that case I was repetitive. So what I've done is to get to the principles, I go into the pyramid and say, what did I write about? And then I try to put a little different spin on it. But in that case, one of the best examples of a transition, the one that I use, is the transition from Liberty Square to Fantasyland over near Haunted Mansion. And that Alex Wright describes in the Imagineering Field Guide to the Magic Kingdom. He describes it in detail. I'm trying to not completely reiterate all the examples from the Imagineering Field Guide or from Christopher Smith's Hidden Backstories and Magical Secrets, or Magical Backstories and Hidden Secrets. I can't remember which one it is, but he's got a series of a couple books that are just chock full of details. And so those have been some great resources, but I'm obviously trying, outside of plagiarism, which is, of course, completely wrong. You don't want to even plagiarize or copy too much in terms of content, right? You want to have original ideas and hopefully present some original content. The challenge with that is there's a lot out there, right? There's just a lot of Disney books. So I guess one big piece of advice I would say is try to become familiar with as much of what's out there as you can so that you can actually contribute new stuff, right? I guess you could just do another Hidden Secrets of Walt Disney World book, but hopefully you can contribute something new to the conversation and become a resource that other people will use.
That kind of reminds me of something that I don't know if this is a quote from someone that I'm paraphrasing, or it's definitely something a college professor told me, is that the best writers are great readers. You have to start with reading first and expanding your knowledge base as much as possible before you put your pen to paper. And that's what you just reminded me of.
And I have to say, you do a nice job of crediting your sources. I liked that you integrated, other people's words in there, but, framed it around to expand on for your own ideas. We always like to leave our listeners with different resources of things that reminded us of the book that we read. But I think in this case, since you're so well researched and have your own chronicled library, which we'll certainly link to, I'd love to hear you just wrap up to share with our listeners some of your favorite Disney resources. I know you've sprinkled a few throughout, but if there's any others you haven't hit on.
Sure. So again, the Imagineering Field Guide series, I was disappointed to hear that they might be out of print, that getting them might be more difficult, but those are a great resource. John Hench's book, Designing Disney, Imagineering the Art of the Show, is a really a fantastic book. In fact, I once saw a Twitter conversation where I think it was Alex Wright said, Hench's book is as close to a textbook on Imagineering as we have. So that's certainly a book I would recommend. Jason Searle's books about Pirates of the Caribbean and the Magic Kingdom and the Disney Mountains are great resources as well. I've enjoyed Andrew Kist's historic books. I've read books 1 and 2 separately. I have number 3. I haven't got to it yet. And actually, I have his World's Fair Great Moments book sitting next to me, but I haven't got to that yet either. I'm trying to think. Oh, and actually two other that I'll recommend. I could go on forever. There's a pair of coffee table books called Walt Disney Imagineering, a behind the ears look at making the magic real and behind the ears look at making the magic more real. Both of those are fantastic resources in terms of understanding how the Imagineers do what they do. And then another somewhat lesser known book by author Jeff Curty, who is pretty well known. He recently wrote Practically Poppins in Every Way. And he's written Disney World Now, Then, and Forever. And he just recently did a travel book about Walt Disney's travels. And he did the Christmas card book. A few years back, he did a book called Walt Disney's Imagineering Legends and the Genesis of the Disney themed show or something like that. It's a collection of short biographies about the first generation of Imagineers, starting with Walt and Harper Goff and going all the way through up through John Hench is the last one he covers, but it covers Rolly Crump and Claude Coates and Blaine Gibson and Mark Davis and Alice Davis and Dick Irvine and just a whole assortment of Imagineers. And that's, I think when you study a subject, I think it's important to study, sort of the theory. And that's like John Hench's book is good about theory. You have to study the practice. And I think Alex Wright's Imagineering Field Guide series is great for that because you can literally see pictures of the examples of what he's talking about. But I also think it's important to study and know about the people that do this work, right? So if you want to understand art, understanding Van Gogh and the study, reading about Van Gogh is probably a useful thing, providing that his type of art is something you care about. I mean, assuming genre, that it's in the same genre. So in this case, reading biographies of Walt Disney and reading books about the Imagineers, I think helps you give some perspective in terms of where they were coming from and how they found themselves in the roles that they found themselves in, to give you some context for how it all fits together.
I have to say you are definitely the expert on Imagineering and Imagineering books that we've talked to since the start of this podcast. But also for me personally, I don't have a lot of background reading about Imagineering. And I just got really excited for a second because all those books you were mentioning, we've talked to Andrew Kist, and we're hoping to talk to him again about his new book series. We have the John Hench, his book on our list of future episodes we want to do. So, Courtney, I'm feeling pretty confident that he's kind of validated our path that we're going down, for us to personally learn more about Imagineering as well.
Yeah, I think your list kind of reinforces why we started this show in the first place. There's such a wealth of knowledge out there in literature itself that inspired Disney and the Imagineers, but also about that itself. So it's been great to talk to you about those. Coming up next, we're going to be jumping into a series tackling the Kingdom Keepers, all 7 books. But don't worry, it's not going to be 7 episodes. If that's not your thing, we'll just be doing 2 or 3 books per episode over the summer. We figured it'd be a fun, easy read for us, and we'd love to have you read along with us. So in a few weeks, we'll be tackling the first 2 books. And if you're not familiar with it, this is a young adult series by Ridley Pearson that takes place in the different Disney parks. So here's the description from Amazon of the first book. In this fantastical thriller, 5 young teens, tapped as models for theme park guides, find themselves pitted against Disney villains and witches that threaten both the future of Walt Disney World and the stability of the world outside its walls. Using a cutting-edge technology called DHI, which stands for Disney Host Interactive and Daylight Hologram Imaging, Finn Whitman, an Orlando teen, and 4 other kids are transformed into hologram projections that guide guests through the park. The new technology turns out, however, to have unexpected effects that are both thrilling and scary.
This should be exciting, Courtney. I have never tackled the Kingdom Keepers, even though I've known they've been around for a while and they're pretty popular.
Yeah, I read this first one over 10 years ago when I was in middle school. So I think when it came out, I was that target audience, but didn't realize that they had really expanded it to 7 books. I mean, that's like Harry Potter length by the time I got to my college program 5 years ago. So it's been on my to-be-read list for a while, and I know this was one when we started the podcast and sent out a survey to some of our social media friends. This one definitely came up in requests a few times. So hopefully people will be interested to follow along with us.
So listeners, we hope that you will join us on our summer reading series and that you'll keep up with us also on the Notably Disney and Tomorrow's Society podcasts. We were recently on their shows, and both episodes are available now on all mediums where you get your podcast. But social media-wise, if you would like to keep in contact with us, you can find us at Book of the Mouse Club on Twitter and on Instagram at Book of the Mouse. Or email us with comments or ideas. We are looking for anything to add to our list after this summer to bookofthemouseclub@gmail.com. And you can find me, Emily, on Instagram and Twitter at Emily_McD.
And you can find me, Courtney, on Instagram at GreatGuthsby or on Twitter at Courtney_Guth. And Lou, why don't you tell our listeners the best place to keep up with you?
Sure. You can find me I'm on Facebook at Lou Prosperi. I might not be the only one, but I'm the only one wearing a Mickey Mouse shirt. And on Twitter at Lou Prosperi, and I think I'm on Instagram at Lou Prosperi as well, though I don't do a lot on Instagram. I mostly look at stuff on Instagram.
We've made sure to tag you so they can find you through ours.
Good, thank you.
You're welcome. And
I have a website that I haven't posted a new blog in quite a while, but it's called WordPress.imagineeringtoolbox.com. And I have overviews of the 2 books and downloads. For each book, I created a workbook, as well as in the case of the pyramid, I actually produced endnotes. So one of the things when I wrote the book, I did extensive footnotes, but my publisher felt that was a little too academic for the audience he was going with. I took the endnotes from my final drafts and put them on my website for people who care. If they really want to find the sources, they have to do a little sleuthing to figure out which one goes with which. But and then there's something else. There was a workbook, and each of the chapters throughout both books have checklists of questions that you can use to sort of how to apply this principle to your own work, and I compiled those as well. So there's a bunch of resources there, and I've tried to keep up with the blog, but I've fallen way behind. I just need to devote some time. I've been focusing on the new book instead. So.
Yeah, I think writing your own book takes a little precedence, so we'll forgive you for that. It sounds like, though, you have a wealth of knowledge there for our readers to dig into. So again, we'll be sure to include links to that in our description. But we like to wrap things up with a quote, and we let our guest of honor, which today is you, do that. What quote have you picked out for us?
So this is a quote by Imagineer John Hench from his Designing Disney book that we talked about before. And it's appropriate not only to the 2 books that I'm talking about, but it definitely applies to the current book I'm working on. So it really fits in sort of the mindset I'm in. And it says, story is the essential organizing principle behind the design of the Disney theme parks. When we design any area of a Disney theme park, we transform a space into a story place. Every element must work together to create an identity that supports the story of that place. And again, that's from John Hench's Designing Disney.
Well, we've enjoyed hearing your story, and hopefully it'll inspire our listeners to create their own stories or take that pyramid with them wherever their careers may take them. Thank you so much for joining us today.
You're very welcome. Thanks for having me. I really enjoyed chatting.
Yeah, Lou, thanks so much for joining us, and we look forward to keeping in touch with you on social media and in the future.
Absolutely. I look forward to it.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, listeners.
Book of the Mouse Club has no affiliation with the Walt Disney Company. The views and opinions expressed by hosts and participants are theirs and theirs alone. They do not represent the organizations or companies they happen to work for.